Mark's in Western Sydney at the moment. I'm down in Melbourne, La Trobe University. This is part of a series for what's called Idea in Society program for La Trobe University. And I'm very pleased and grateful that you're able to come along, talk about, in particular, the New South Wales catastrophe for Labor. In general, I think Labor and social democracy in Australia and beyond. I can just say this, Mark, I was one of the people who was very taken with your diary. A lot of the political commentariat and the politicians had trouble with it. It seemed to have an incredible readership, however, of, let's call them ordinary people. I think now we can see that a lot of what you said in the diary was rather prophetic, to do with the dysfunctional nature of Labor culture, which at the time I think was perhaps harder for people to see. It was quite a time ago. So perhaps I want to do the obvious thing, which is ask you to perhaps beginning with Western Sydney, to say what you think were the reasons for the catastrophe, the predictable catastrophe that happened to Labor last weekend.
Well, I think there are two interesting case studies in Western Sydney, two electorates that Labor lost with 20% swings. I think when the party gets a 20% swing anywhere, you need to drill down into the local factors and looking at the local candidates. And the two seats are Smithfield and Campbelltown. Smithfield is quintessential Western Sydney, had been held by a former police and transport minister, Carl Scully. And the fellow who was elected in 2007, Ninos Kashaba, suffered a 10% swing then, and then last Saturday he suffered another 20% swing. So Labor's lost 30% of its two-party preferred vote in the seat of Smithfield in the space of two elections. It's gone from 75% of the two-party preferred vote to 45%, which is an absolutely stunning disintegration of the Labor vote. And I know the Kashabas well because Carl Scully, the previous member, always boasted that they were fantastic in terms of recruiting Syrian members to the Labor Party. And Anwar Kashaba had done that, and now Ninos, who's lost the seat, I suppose he stands as the first experiment in an ethnic branch stacker dynasty in the Labor Party. And I think it's a very, very interesting case study in how the internal dynamic in the Labor Party was that, well, if we get the numbers here for the right wing over the left and we'll bring in all these Syrian people into the local branches, then control of the Labor Party numbers in Western Sydney was the pathway to a parliamentary career. That the real political contest was getting the numbers inside the party, not having to worry about the votes outside the party. So the whole thing has caved in to the point where branch stacking in the seat of Smithfield is not sufficient to deliver someone a parliamentary career. There's the novel perspective that you actually have to win the votes of the electorate. And Ninos Kashaba has lost 30% of the two-party preferred vote in the space of 4 years. The other seat that's of interest, also a 20% swing, is the seat of Campbelltown. I'm sitting in the Campbelltown campus now, so we're right in the middle of it. The sitting member, Graham West, retired at this election. He saw the writing on the wall, and he was replaced by Nick Bleasdale, who didn't live in the electorate. He lived in the adjoining seat of Macquarie Fields. But Nick's interesting because he represents what has become the new prototype Labor candidate. He's a carpenter. Mark Arbib, when he was the party secretary, very keen on looking at the focus group results, picked up animosity to what had been, and I suppose for the last 20 years, has been a damning commentary on Labor, that there are too many candidates are political staffers, union officials. So in key seats, Arbib got into the habit of just finding someone who had non-staffer, non-union credentials. And they plucked Bleasdale from the air because he's a carpenter. Now, you don't have to be a carpenter who lives in the seat or knows anyone in the seat or has a popular following in the local electorate, but
you have to be a carpenter.
Prototype is to pick someone, in this case a tradie, and just put him forward on the basis that he's non-staffer. Well, that wasn't sufficient either, because the Liberals put up a local policeman who was known in the community, and with the other factors that contributed to a big anti-Labor swing in Campbelltown, the Liberals were able to pick up a seat they've never held in its current form as a suburban seat. They held it in the 1960s, but in the last 40 years it's been safe Labor, and the party suffered a 20% swing, not because Bleasdale's a bad person, he's not, he's quite a nice fellow, but he just wasn't credentialed in that electorate. And they overlooked some people who had come through the local branches and were known in the local area to pick Bleasdale on the OBIB model of just pick someone because of their professional title, not because of their popularity or profile in the seat. So I think in Smithfield and Campbelltown you've got a terrible breakdown really in the Labor model of culture and candidate selection, and the result on the ground has been devastating.
And how large a factor do you think selection of candidates is compared to, looking at the situation from Victoria, as where I am, I suppose there have been 3 or 4 general factors that have been stressed by the commentariat. One would be the toxic nature of the factional system. Another would be the dysfunctional nature of the right-wing Sussex Street machine. And, you know, there are many other, and another thing that keeps on cropping up is the power of trade union bosses and the effect they've had on New South Wales Labor over time. So I suppose what I'm asking you is how these very general factors that commentators are now concentrating on, how they relate down at the grassroots to mistakes made in candidate selection.
Well, the factors you've mentioned are almost cliches now about the modern Labor Party. They're bandied around in the political analysis and media debate. But I think it's very useful to understand that when we talk about degeneration of Labor culture, it has a local electorate consequence. And we shouldn't just look at these things as generalised slogans about the nature of the modern Labor Party. You need to analyse what happens where it matters, and that is in holding lower house seats, winning or losing government. And the example in Smithfield, where the whole internal party focus was on ethnic branch stacking and getting the numbers locally, no regard for what the electorate thought about any of this, that's a classic instance of where the insular, dysfunctional culture of Labor, which is discussed generally, down on the ground has had a devastating impact in losing what had been a traditional Labor seat. So too, the commentary about union officials and union domination, there has been a Labor Party reaction against that, recognising that in marginal seats now, because of the public's understanding of terms like faithless men, union bosses, factional thuggery, the whole imagery of Joe Tripodi and Eddie Obeid as so-called factional devils in New South Wales, the party has reacted to try and look for a clever way of countering that in key seats, in seats where there's a contest. And the reaction in the seat of Campbelltown, replacing a sitting member, was to bring in a fellow solely for the reason that he could call himself a carpenter. Well, it might have worked for Christ and his family, but it wasn't going to work in Campbelltown. And
we're both
lesson in that the real problem in both instances, Smithfield and Campbelltown, the ethnic branch stacker and the carpenter, is that the Labor culture has hollowed out so badly. There are no viable Labor Party branches. 30 or 40 years ago, joining the Labor Party, one went to branches where there were genuine working people who came for a genuine reason, in numbers, to discuss issues, local, state, federal, international, and a young person joining up had to go through the rigours of genuine political debate. You argued the toss with local social democratic working class warriors, veterans of many years of branch debate. All those debates, those contests, that political grounding has been lost. And the Labor Party has bred a generation of candidates and members who have credentials based on imagery, that is, they're not a union official or a staffer, or credentials based on ethnic branch stacking, the factional control of numbers, or people who are just plain unsuited to a parliamentary life. And one of the stunning things about New South Wales is just the amazing number of scandals. The number of backbenchers and ministers who got pinged for rorting electorate allowances, travel allowances, surfing the web for porn on their parliamentary computer. All things that I think, wouldn't have happened 30 or 40 years ago in the Labor Party. We had a genuine grounding in real politics, real debate, real contest of ideas. And you didn't have to go through the process of imagery or ethnic branch stacking to be a Labor member. You could do it because you were an effective debater and propagator of political ideas through the local branch system. So that culture is now gone, and it's been replaced by something we saw on Saturday that in electoral terms is a devastating flop.
Can I just take on from that? In the diary, I think I remember that you report having a conversation with Bob Carr, and he's saying that the days in which you can get a rank and file membership are over. I think you also, it's you or someone was quoting Oscar Wilde saying that you won't ever be able to bring about socialism because it would take up too many evenings of committee meeting. Is there a sense in which your analysis is to do with something that all political parties, not just Labor in New South Wales, faces, which is the death of that sort of, even if I might call it even old-fashioned political commitment, and that every time the Labor Party goes into analysis now, as it has recently with the Carr and Faulkner and Steve Brack's report, there is a renewed fantasy about getting mass membership of party branches, but it kind of never happens. Can you respond to all that?
Well, it is fantasy for the reason that the times have changed, and these problems are not necessarily confined to Labor. They're problems across all parties in all parts of the Western world. But I think for parties, left of centre, parties that rely on ideas, a sense of momentum from social progress, social equity, that call themselves a political cause, a movement, you do rely much more than the conservative side of politics on a sense of popular support and a core group of party activists at the local level who can make a difference. I think it is more important to have mass membership on the Labor side than on the Conservative side of politics. But the two trends working against that, of course, are the end of the Cold War. The political debates are not as clearly defined or as intensely fought as they were 40 years ago. And the other trend is changing technology. People sitting in working class suburbs now, the local branch meeting with its fiercely contested political debates and battle-scarred veterans beating up on young hopefuls coming through the branch system. For a lot of people that was entertaining. That was a good thing to go do on a Monday night. But now with the internet, social media, the popularity of television itself, people have got other forms of entertainment and interest in their lives, and politics is fading into some sort of weird novelty that people engage in, like we're doing now, because we're oddballs. That's how politics is seen. People who talk seriously about politics in the general community are seen as odd. So the hope of having a broad mass membership in a political party has faded away. But there's a big difference between those challenges and what Labor has become, and that is a tightly controlled oligarchy without any amount of political debate and contest. Sure, you might be able to sustain 100 active branches across Sydney. Well, consolidate them into 10, where you do have genuine debate and political grounding and experience for young people coming through the system, so they will be effective parliamentarians in the future, instead of having the cancer of ethnic branch stacking or the imagery of recruiting people as candidates for all the wrong reasons. So there are things you can do to maintain a viable, contested political culture, as opposed to what Labor has done, which is just to collapse the local branch system and concentrate influence and power in the party in the hands of a dozen union officials and party officials.
Can I ask you a very simple and direct question? I mean, you spoke before about the astonishing number of scandals that in recent times New South Wales Labor government has amused the nation by, as it were. Is there something particularly rank about New South Wales Labor Party which is not true of, in your experience, Victoria or Western Australia or Queensland? Is there something kind of native to New South Wales Labor now which produces this amount of scandal and corruption?
Oh, you've just had the jailing of a Queensland Labor minister, and there have been comparable scandals in other parts of the country. In New South Wales, though, it seemed to be in proportion to the length of time in government, that if a party is there for 10, 12, 16 years, and there's almost an assumption that opposition is impossible, when people do look more inwards and more thoroughly inwards, and the culture becomes more incestuous. You could just go through the list of the 14 or 15 right-wing members who were scandal prone in the last 4 or 5 years of Labor government, and they were hand-picked for factional reasons, for stacking reasons, in one case because a woman was related to a factional heavy, and another person was the son of a factional warlord in New South Wales. So this incestuous selection of candidates has backfired badly. It was an amazing parade of scandals, and it effectively meant that, you know, whoever was leading the State Labor Party was going to cop a pounding in the campaign, because the electorate had turned off. They'd made their judgment based on these scandals, and I think the electorate worked out that these people surfing the net for porn, rorting their allowances, these are not the Labor members of Parliament that we've been used to in the past. Labor members had a reputation for working class integrity and honesty in their local constituency. So the electorate just got a sense that the nature of these Labor members has dramatically changed. Their personality, their character, their rationale for being in politics, the way in which they got into Parliament. And the electorate passed a damning judgment on that deterioration in culture and personnel.
Mark, in the last Fin Review column you wrote, you called for federal intervention into the New South Wales Party. And last night I saw John Faulkner almost agreeing with that idea, or coming close to saying that he thought maybe federal intervention might be needed. And my problem with that, in a way, is if there's something in general problematic about Labor political culture, why would we expect a federal intervention to solve much in New South Wales? I mean, would Mark Habib be one of the people that was intervening into the New South Wales branch now, if you get my drift?
No, well, Habib is one of those who exercises control, remote control, in the New South Wales branch. He's the federal leader of the New South Wales right, and he'd have a big say in how the branch is run. And Robert, you've got this absolute guarantee right now, as we're speaking, tonight, tomorrow, for the rest of the week, the right-wing strategy in New South Wales will be, how do we give a little bit of ground, the appearance of change, the rhetoric of reform, without losing the thing that's absolutely dear to our hearts and our reason for being in politics: power inside the party. Now, I was working for the Labor head office the last time the party went out badly in New South Wales in 1988. The Unsworth government was hammered, not as badly as the Keneally government, but it was a devastating defeat, just the same. And the whole strategy in the New South Wales right was, how do we repel the barbarians at the gates? What can we offer them? A few bones. What do we throw to them? With a little bit of change, a little bit of consultation, the rhetoric that we're all change people, we'll learn a lot. Let's have a lot of forums where people can talk their angst out of the system. And then we'll get on with the business, which is that we run the show, and we're not going to change, and we're going to do the clever things electorally to get the party back into government, which they did with Bob Carr in 1995. So without federal intervention, all you get is the appearance, the rhetoric, the talk of minor changes with none of the substance. Yeah. The only way in which Labor Party state branches have ever changed in Victoria, in 1970 when Whitlam intervened, in Queensland, which was just as bad as New South Wales is today, when Hayden intervened in 1980, the only way you get substantial reform of state branches is through federal intervention. Not federal intervention where Mark Habib is in charge, but federal intervention where genuine party reformers are part of a reconstituted administrative committee or tribunal. And you've got people in New South Wales who've seen the worst of it from the inside, who are, to their credit, willing to say, look, these things need to change. And I suggest that some of the people who could be involved, genuine party reformers, give them the mandate of federal intervention to make the changes, rather than all the cosmetic stuff that you'll hear in the coming weeks and months leading into the June party conference.
And just as a technical matter, I mean, I know you were very close to Gough Whitlam in the past and have thought about how important the intervention in Victoria was in 1970 to his control over the party later on, and I know something about that as well. But I just wondered, how would federal intervention now work in fact, practically? What would you see happening if it did occur?
Well, it relies on the initiative of the federal parliamentary leader, the Prime Minister Julia Gillard. And in the Fin Review article you mentioned, I quoted her views some 5 years ago that there was a New South Wales disease, that factionalism was cancerous, that these problems wouldn't go away unless there was genuine treatment of them, that doing nothing is not an option. So Gillard in the past has expressed views that are consistent with the concept of federal intervention today in New South Wales. What happens is that the National Executive of the Labor Party disbands the ruling body in New South Wales, the Administrative Committee, as they disbanded the Central Executive in Victoria in 1970, and they replace it with a new body where you need serious party reformers, respected figures, that can get on with the job of changing things, changing the culture of the New South Wales right, diminishing the power of the trade union clique that has caused so much trouble, and doing something positive about rebuilding a contested, viable, vibrant branch culture for the Labor Party. I think make it more of a branch Labor Party than a union Labor Party, which is what it's very much become in New South Wales.
And Mark, given what you know, I know you're now an outsider to the party, but given what you know, do you think there's any chance that Julia Gillard will take that course?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely for this reason, that when Gillard was the Deputy Prime Minister, there was a kerfuffle in New South Wales where her factional ally Laurie Ferguson had lost through a redistribution his safe Labor seat of Reid, and he had to be parachuted in somewhere, and they put him into my old seat of Werriwa. And Gillard was the instigator of that move. And I understand that at the time of the coup against Kevin Rudd, the New South Wales right said to Gillard, well, we'll support you in taking over against Rudd, but we don't want any more of this interference, this playing around with our seats, as you did with Laurie Ferguson moving him from Reid to Werriwa. So I think Gillard's locked herself into a standoff with the New South Wales right, and she'd have to break that promise to them not to intervene and interfere in their internal affairs. But I pointed out in my Financial Review column, well, she's broken the promise on not introducing a carbon tax, and I support that. I support action on climate change, so at least that's some movement in the right direction, limited as it might be. And she should do the same, I think, just as importantly, in breaking her commitment to the New South Wales right and getting stuck in. Don't just move one member around, as she did with Laurie Ferguson. Get stuck in and reform the whole state branch, move a lot of people around and a lot of them out the door. And
I've noticed actually in your writing a change on the trade union question, that in the diary you say, if I'm not wrong, that it would be, I think you're in favour of weakening or breaking the link between the trade union movement and the Labor Party, but it would be such a big thing that it would be like another split in the party, the 1950s revisited. Whereas recently it seems to me you're beginning to say you think there should be a severing. If it's going to be a social democratic party, there shouldn't be any particular power or privilege given to trade unions. What's your position in general on that now?
Well, I think in terms of practical reform of the party, the only way forward is to say unions that want to be affiliated to the Labor Party, well, that's fine, and there should be affiliations from other social movements, green, environmental movements. If they want to affiliate to the Labor Party, that would be good. Anyone who's got a progressive view of the world and good in their heart should be welcome. But the union affiliation shouldn't bring with it a power beyond the size of unionism in society. That if the unions are 15% of the workforce, well, they should have 15% of the numbers at Labor conferences instead of 50%. They've got 3 times the level of representation that they would have under normal democratic principles. So if you're going to try and reform the Labor Party, it has to be on that basis. But to step back, and the reason I got out of politics and you rightly say, I'm more or less an outsider to the Labor movement these days, is that I thought generally that and other policy issues were insoluble, that there was no viable answer, that the reforms themselves would always have difficulties. But if you're going to try something, I think the reform program I've mentioned is the best approach. Mm-hmm. But in my own situation, I'm quite fatalistic about what can be achieved and whether it will result in a transformation of society itself, which should be the Labor Party's overarching goal.
Can I turn now a little bit to recent history of federal Labor? First thing, in a piece that was published in a magazine I'm involved with, The Monthly, a few months ago, you said essentially you say this, if I've got it right, that if Labor is going to be anything, it's got to be a party of major progressive social reform. And in your interpretation, there were two great moments in recent Labor history: the period under Whitlam with social and educational reform, social welfare, educational reform; period under Hawke and Keating with the liberalisation, deregulation of the Australian economy. But that when you look at the period of the Rudd government, apart from symbols, Kyoto and the apology, there's a kind of emptiness, a lack of achievement. And I wanted to ask you a couple of things about that. One, do you think that underestimates the success of the Rudd government in manoeuvring Australia's way through the global financial crisis? Question one. Question two, why do you think there was that emptiness with Rudd and the 2.5 years of Rudd government?
Well, we can have a debate about the effectiveness of Rudd's Keynesian economics, but for the electorate, it wasn't seen as an achievement because it just merely maintained the status quo, that Australia had been through a very long period of economic growth. There was financial turbulence internationally. How much of that would have washed through into Australia if our federal government had done nothing? Well, that's debatable. A lot of economists say that we'd been quarantined for a range of reasons and the impact wouldn't have been a recession in this country. But let's assume that Rudd did the right thing and they averted economic problems through their Keynesian package. In the eyes of the electorate, it didn't actually change things because the economy was growing beforehand and it's growing today. And people have got into the habit of putting all these economic successes right in their pocket, literally. And they expect politicians to be focused on the cost of living issues. I mean, you hear so much, it's quite remarkable that after, what have we had now, 20 years of economic growth that's transformed the nature of working class suburbs, places that I grew up in, places I know well. You can drive through them today and it's all double-storey houses, big four-wheel drives in the big driveway with a double garage. People are doing far better than they ever could have dreamt of 20 or 30 years ago in these suburban areas. And it's remarkable to think that having seen this massive amount of material wealth flow into the pockets of ordinary Australians for 20 years, the number one political issue is cost of living pressures. That's just code for greed. People want more and more and more. Not content with double garage, give me a triple. The next thing will be triple-storey houses instead of these double-storey McMansions. So they just expect the political system to deliver more and more money to them and the politicians play the game. There's always this focus on tossing money at the swinging voters in the marginal seats. They call it cost of living pressure. What did Rudd used to say? Working families.
I think he said that.
For greed. It's all just code for greed and pandering to it. So the electorate didn't see that Rudd had achieved much on the economic front. He just continued what they expected the federal government to do. In terms of lasting achievements, filling the void of emptiness, the big thing, of course, was climate change and the emission trading scheme. And when people come to write the history of the Labor Party in the early part of this century, the decision and the flip-flopping and the absolute abomination of where they've got to on climate change will be the number one chapter in that particular book. Because from the abandonment of the emission trading scheme to Gillard's Citizens' Assembly to her promise not to introduce a carbon tax to the situation they've got themselves in today, is just inconsistent, hopeless policy making instead of actually standing for something you believe in. Rudd called it the great moral challenge of our time, which is true. And well, if that's the case, people would expect a Labor Party to crusade on that challenge, stand by its policy and face the electorate believing in something. Now, I'm sure every Labor supporter in New South Wales would think, well, that's a devastating election loss, but wouldn't it have been good if it had been a loss over a principle, over something the party was actually fighting for? And today in New South Wales, where they've been reduced to 25% of the primary vote, the party would have far better prospects if that 25% was the support of people who supported a big crusade for Labor, something that was important to them. There was a burning passion, and it gave you something to build on for the future. But the 25% are really those who must have thought, well, they stand for nothing, but I'll still give them a vote. And the party's much weakened from that position. You're better off fighting and losing on something important than fighting for nothing and losing big in any case. So the void that has been left on climate change, I think, is devastating for Labor. And it's also produced tactically in terms of politics, a ridiculous situation where the Labor Party now doesn't know what sort of relationship should it have with the Greens. Are the Greens expected to provide preferences for Labor in key seats, or are the Greens the rivals and you attack them, as Gillard has in recent times? Anyone watching this webcast, I'd direct them to Bob Carr's blog to look at a classic case of the split personality of the modern Labor Party and its attitude to the Greens. He wrote a blog, I think, 48 hours ago, attacking the Greens as an evil political force, threatening Labor in inner city seats like Balmain and Marrickville. Isn't it great that threat at least was fought off? And today he's written a blog saying, isn't it terrible that Labor didn't get a very high proportion of Green preferences in key seats? So Labor's got this split personality in its attitude to the Greens. And what to do about that in the future is also massively unresolved. So the main Green issue, climate change, has been terrible, and the main political issue of the relationship with the Greens has also been all over the shop.
Now, can I take them in turn, those two issues, and push on a bit? I'll put an argument which is slightly different from the one you put in the monthly, which is essentially Labor has to have a bold program if it is to prosper. I'd say this, I think the two kind of biggest changes I've seen since I've been observing politics in Australia, the end of the White Australia policy negotiated so successfully. Secondly, the deregulation of the economy in the 80s and 90s. Both of them, I think, were marked by having what I call bipartisan political support. And I don't think either could have worked as well or as successfully had there been one party opposed, one party in favour. My spin on the climate change question, where we agree is that I think it's the fundamental question of the age. And like you, I think Labor should take it on. But I think the tragedy of climate change has been the failure under Howard and now under Abbott of the coalition to see that issue for its significance. And I think it does, because I think it is a difficult issue for any party. I think that's the great tragedy of the time, and I think the difficulties facing Labor are immense because of the populism now, let's say, of Tony Abbott, or because of the foot dragging that Howard showed. Could you respond to that?
Well, I'd dispute your analysis with White Australia policy and economic liberalisation, because I think we forget how hard it was for pioneers within the Labor Party to actually advance those ideas. When Whitlam and Dunstan spoke about a non-discriminatory immigration policy in the early 1960s, they were outcasts inside the Labor Party. And the coalition under Menzies was, I think Menzies is quoted reliably as saying that White Australia would end over his dead body. And in the end it did. But it took a big effort by Labor reformers and pioneers to start up the momentum for ending White Australia. So too with economic liberalisation. If you'd said in 1980 at a Labor Party conference that you believed in taking down the tariff walls, deregulating the industrial relations system, in privatising old entities, government entities, you would have been the only person in the room saying it. But the fact that Keating, Dawkins, Peter Walsh, a group of reformers in the Hawke government got these things through, and we've got the lasting benefits of it in terms of economic growth, showed that people were willing to fight from day one. Keating didn't stand up in 1983 or 84 in the caucus and say, oh, this question of floating the dollar, why don't we have a citizens' assembly to sort out what people might think about it, or taking down the tariff walls? Why don't we have a sort of a bit of a public plebiscite to see what's going on, or why don't we convene a few focus groups to see what they say out in Penrith? You know, people fought for these things because they believed in them. And I think that's the difference today, that the Labor Party on climate change, the public's got a sense of, well, does Gillard really believe in it? We know that she was one of those who convinced Rudd to drop the emission trading scheme. In the campaign, she promised not to advance a carbon tax. So I think a reform crusade without belief, without passion, is always going to flounder. And sure, Abbott has been terrible on the question of climate change. But so too the Labor Party has been half-hearted. And I think in equal measure, they're both big problems.
Now, on the second question of the Greens, it seems to me that Labor is now in a very peculiar position. It seems to be, at best, to get about, this is federal Labor, to get about mid-30s in primary votes. And it may, if it does very well, get a bit higher than that. Therefore, it seems to me that it's sort of as absolutely obvious that if Labor is to be returned, it needs to get a very significant number of Greens preferences. If it doesn't, it's kind of finished. What I don't understand about Labor is how they seem, as you say, with Bob Carr's blog, to not have worked this out. That in fact, their only future is now in close relations, competitive, but nevertheless close relations in the end with the Greens. How do you see the relationship evolving? I mean, if Labor is going to compete fiercely and to be disparaging of the Greens, eventually many Greens voters are not going to give them their preferences, I take it. So that unless there's a good relationship, I don't see much of a future for Labor. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue, and the New South Wales result was just further demonstration of how abysmal Labor's become in its thinking about the Greens, because there was no Green preference strategy in New South Wales. You just think that if your primary vote's so low, your only possible hope of being competitive in the key seats is to have a good flow of preferences from the Greens. So New South Wales Labor went into the election with barely a Green preference being allocated in a how to vote in any booth in any part of the state. And they've got a result that reflects that. The policy issues aside, I think the relationship with the Greens is also very much a cultural question. I found in my time, and I think it's true today, that the factional figures who were most opposed and most resistant to working with the Greens were the most authoritarian types. Right-wing people like Steve Hutchins, Martin Ferguson on the left, real authoritarian types who believe in holding power as strongly and as closely as they can for as long as possible. They had the highest level of hostility to the Greens because they didn't like the idea of a force outside the Labor Party getting some sort of legitimacy and in policy terms concessions. So there's a cultural issue. As the Labor Party's become more of an oligarchy, power's been concentrated in the hands of a small number of factional heavies, there is this cultural, attitudinal resistance to working with the Greens. That, oh no, we're not going to support these trots and so forth because we run the show. So unless that attitude changes and Labor works out that it's very unlikely to win elections, federal or state, without a good working relationship with the Greens and preference strategy and so forth, unless that changes, then you're going to continue to have this split personality out on public display. And again, the New South Wales election is a good prototype for what's happening there.
Just a couple of things on that. One is, at the same time as New South Wales held its election, there was an election in Baden-Württemberg in Germany, a state, southern Germany.
I missed that one, sorry.
I think most people missed it, but it was actually interesting. It happened the same weekend. There, Labor got about the same votes. Sorry, Labor in New South Wales got about the same as the Social Democrats in Germany, roughly a bit over 20%. The Greens got, I think it was 24% in Baden-Württemberg, and there's now a real, what's called in Europe a red-green alliance is in formation in various parts of Germany and elsewhere. I was really going to ask you what you think of the Greens as a party in Australia and in New South Wales, whether there's a way in which it could go beyond the 10% of inner city voters into something which is more substantial, or whether they're going to always stay as, third or fourth party with about 10 or 12% of the vote.
Oh, I suppose my long-term view is that climate change is real. Climate change will be the great 50, 100-year driver of political and economic change in our society. That climate change will directly challenge the materialism, the greedy cost of living arguments that we spoke of earlier, and will fundamentally challenge all the political assumptions we've got about, how you win elections and how you campaign in marginal seats. I think through that process, the Greens, whether as a formal political party or as a social movement, can only get stronger. Now, what happens in the short to medium term with the Green Party, I think Bob Brown is very much the glue that holds them together. They'll face transformation issues that as they become more prominent in the political system, the media will give them greater scrutiny. This is also interesting from New South Wales, the two inner city seats where the Murdoch media continued their jihad against the Greens. Balmain and Marrickville put the spotlight right on the two Green candidates in terms of some of their business dealings and background views. Under that scrutiny, they didn't do very well. So they've got to get used to that. They'll have factional power struggle tensions of their own. So I don't think the long-term trend is so much about what happens to the Green Party post-Bob Brown. It's going to be what happens with the Green movement and the whole cascading process of economic and political change that comes out of climate change itself. So, it's a bit like Joe and Lai's view of the French Revolution. It's too early to tell.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to wait a long time, well past our lifetime, to see how these issues unfold. But in terms of hard-headed politics, Labor needs to recognise that it's probably in the situation now that the Liberals were with the DLP in the 50s and 60s. There's another force. Their preferences are vital to winning elections, and unless you work out a way of ensuring that there's a decent preference vote from the Greens, Labor will struggle to win general elections, state and federal. And they need to crack heads, deal with these authoritarian types, and recognise that they have to have a sound working relationship with the Greens, or New South Wales type results will be repeated into the future.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's something you raised there which I can't resist asking you about. In the diary, a lot of it is, not a lot, but there are considerable references to the malign influence, in your view, of the Murdoch press in Australia. Has anything happened since you left politics to change your opinion on that issue?
Well, it can't be said they're a force for enlightenment and social progress. The editorial line of The Australian is to pick these Green Party people apart and to run as a sort of quasi-political force themselves. I mean, an independent, objective newspaper wouldn't feel the need to focus in on the Greens the way that the Murdoch flagship does. And I think what's constant in the Murdoch press is that if you walk into Parliament House and go up to the Murdoch bureau there on the top floor, the people who work there and their bosses think that it's the epicentre of power in Parliament House. It's not over in the Prime Minister's office, that's not, and the ministerial wing, that's not where the real decisions and influence is exercised. It's inside the Murdoch empire and its outposts. So they've got very much an inflated view of their own importance, and they operate as a quasi-political party. I think I quoted something in a Financial Review column looking at the Australian newspaper, quoted one of their editorials, where if you just took it in isolation, it was like the platform statement of a political party. They have well-formed views and they know this and they know that, and they're going to impose them and exercise their influence in the political system to get these outcomes. It wasn't the statement of a newspaper, as we sort of expect newspapers to be. It was the statement of a political party. And the Murdoch media, for want of a better term, is sort of an anti-green party in Australian politics, exercising its influence through its newspapers and other media outlets.
I mean, it reminds me of...
Robert, I think you can gather from that my view hasn't changed very much.
I didn't think it would. There was when I read your column in the Fin Review, it reminded me of a statement of Stanley Baldwin, who was facing hostile press in the 1920s and 30s. And he said that basically power without responsibility. I mean, the difference between political parties and press barons is the press barons and their outfits don't need to get elected, so they can do what they like and never bear the consequences of the things they do. And I've felt, as you probably know, for the past 10 or 15 years that the degree of influence that the Murdoch press plays in our politics, particularly because of the Australian, but also the Herald Sun down here, Daily Telegraph where you are, is utterly disproportionate and a danger to the kind of prospering of various causes, the most important of which is climate change. Can I ask one final question of you, and then we'll open the audience here, and if there are webcast questions, if you're willing to answer them, we'd be grateful. But anyhow, I suppose that I really want to ask you is whether you think there's a good prospect for the Gillard government, or whether you think it's going to disappoint in the way, obviously, you think the Rudd government did. Is she likely to take on the climate change question and other questions with conviction, do you think?
Well, I think it's too late. Conviction comes from believing in something, and if you believed in action on climate change, you wouldn't have advised Rudd to drop the ETS. And if she believed in climate change and a carbon tax, she wouldn't have promised not to do that policy during the election campaign and come up with what was clearly a ridiculous political tactic just to fob it off into the future, the so-called Citizens' Assembly. So conviction politics is not something you can sort of invent or you find down the back of the garden one day. You've actually got to believe it and do it from day one. And her record on climate change has made the whole Labor effort in that area quite hollow. It's a dangerous issue for them because it plays right into the cost of living scare campaign, which is a real mantra in Australian politics. So Abbott will be out there doing his worst in suburban marginal seats. But you have to then wonder, does Labor get a lot of credit for action on climate change if, informed left-leaning voters think that, they're doing it, but they don't really believe in it. Yeah. So that hollowness is going to be a difficulty, and for the Gillard government, it's obviously going to be a central issue, and it's quite problematic.